France's invisible hand, disguised as a partnership, continues to shape policies in West Africa, often at the cost of self-determination, independence, and economic development. We all remember the illegal invasion of Libya by NATO forces in 2011, as well as France's role in Rwanda's 1994 genocide. We also remember the millions of Algerians killed during the illegal French occupation of the country. Not to forget the neocolonial manipulation of central banks using the CFA Franc and countless more injustices. The current wave of Pan-Africanism and the dream of a united Africa is fast gathering pace by the day, and the current Niger Coup is the perfect testament to this development. A majority of Africans support the coup because of the decades of exploitation and imperialism by France and the USA, as well as the role of AFRICOM in the region. AFRICOM is short for the United States Africa Command. On their official website, the role of the US Africa Command is to assume responsibility for US military activities in all areas of Africa except Egypt. But their actual activities are more sinister than that. While many Nigerians languish in darkness, uranium mined in a Lit town in Niger powers at least 1 in 3 bulbs in France. The tiny town pays the ultimate price to keep the lights on in France, not to mention the numerous cases of cancer and other diseases associated with uranium mining. Note that up to 75% of all uranium supplies come from Kazakhstan, Niger, and Canada. In this episode of Serial History, we'll explore the neocolonialism by France, USA, and its allies, as well as AFRICOM's wicked role in West Africa, largely focusing on the recent Niger Coup. We will also touch on how China, Russia, and the rest of the BRICS nations are countering the West in the region. But first, let's discuss briefly what's happening in Niger. In April of 2021, President Mohamed Bazoum was elected by Nigerians in a largely peaceful but disputed election. Some 2 years after the pro-West president was inaugurated, he was deposed in a military coup that began on July 26, 2023, when he was retained by members of his presidential guard. There are many reasons for the uprising in Niger, including unfair gold exploitation practices, the US setting up a drone base in Niamey, which is the capital, the deposing of civilian presidents, and undue influence on national elections. Military leaders have since dissolved the government and suspended the constitution. General Abdurrahman Chiani, who had been the head of the Bazoum's presidential guard, was named the president of the military junta that would be leading the country. This new junta has said that it is ending all military cooperations with France and that all agreements on the presence of French troops would be cancelled. Niger is the only latest country in the region to undergo a coup, after Mali in 2020 and Burkina Faso in 2022. Both are former colonies that gained independence from France in 1960. The junta leaders in Burkina Faso and Mali have already warned that any attempt to restore Bazoum in Niger via military intervention will be viewed as a declaration of war on all the 3 nations. Troops working for Wagner, which is the Russian mercenary group, are meanwhile operating within Niger's neighborhood and have offered their support to the rebellious Nigerians. So what exactly is AFRICOM? Why are Nigerians expelling the French military from the country? Headquartered in Stuttgart, Germany, the combatant command unit largely operates in Africa. The fact that AFRICOM failed to find a home in the African continent says it all. Since George W. Bush commissioned the establishment of AFRICOM in 2007, there has been a notable increase in instability in the Sahel. This is a vast region that stretches along the Sahara Desert southern rim from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. So this raises the question, Does it really serve Africa's interests? The answer is an emphatic no, and the evidence is too much to refute. No wonder Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger have kicked out the French militia out of the region. How about the history of Niger and the French? To understand the revolutionary events in West Africa unfolding as we speak today, we must go back in time. Niger is a country located in the heart of West Africa with a population of about 24.4 million. Niger is home to several indigenous nations, the largest of which include the Hausa, the Songhai Zama, and the Tuaregs. The country's capital is Niamey. Colonial France first began the invasion of Niger in 1899, but the local population determinedly resisted the notorious expedition. However, the severe famines of 1913 to 1915 and the Tuareg uprisings of 1916 to 1917 weakened the nation, making it easier for the French to establish a colonial administration under civilian control. Following the Second World War, France was increasingly under pressure to relinquish its stranglehold over its colonies. Since the French pursued their assimilation policy, consultative legislative assemblies were set up locally in Niger. These changes secured the assent of a tiny new elite, the so-called évolués, that is, those who had been trained in French schools. Most of these elites were from the Songhai Zuma nation. In theory, Niger gained its independence on 3rd August of 1960, but it was obvious that they were still firmly in the grip of the colonial clause and laws. This guy, Hamadi Diori, became the first president of Niger. He ruled the nation with an iron fist until he was ousted by Seyni Kounché, a military strongman. Kounché then held power till his death in 1987. At the beginning of the 21st century, increasing demand for the adoption of Islamic Sharia law was the root of many conflicts between Islamic activists and the Nigerians who were not in favor of the strict religious code. In 2020, the recently dethroned President Bizuma came to power through elections that were largely influenced by the West. It's no surprise that these new citizens of the Nigerian nation have decided to rise up against the neocolonialists. In this final bit, let's explore the current geopolitics in the region. The July 2023 Russia-African Summit summarizes perfectly the trajectory that many African nations are taking. China, Russia, India, and other Asian and Latin American nations in the global south have been stepping up trade with African nations, making it a win-win for these regions. This proves to be a threat to USA and European interests in the region. The upcoming BRICS meetings in August of 2023 to be held in South Africa is a further testament of the cordial relationship between African nations and the rest of the global south. BRICS is an acronym for the coalition between Brazil, India, Russia, China, and South Africa. These nations house over 40% of the world population and 31% of the global purchasing power. It is reported that Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Argentina, the UAE, and 40 more nations have applied to join the bloc. It is precisely the numerous shared traditional values and history among these nations that has driven BRICS' attractiveness. If you can remember, Russia and China were instrumental in helping the liberation of many African nations against colonialism and imperialism. Furthermore, these nations have established security treaties to counter AFRICOM's continuous expansion in West Africa. Burkina Faso's leader Ibrahim Traoré agreed with Putin to reopen the Russian embassy in the country. Even better, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have created a common military bloc that will retaliate against the foreign invaders. History suggests that these nations have shared a lot in common, including the fight against oppression and colonialism imposed by Western nations. So, how does the West exploit Niger? As you might have established by now, France and USA have been exploiting the country for decades. The CFA Franc, which is pegged on the euro, is another tool for imperialism and colonialism used by Europe. The large uranium mines in Niger have also caused major radiation, which poses serious risks to the people of Niger. Not to forget the child labor going on in the region, keeping in mind that half of Niger's population is below the age of 15. In the aftermath of the NATO war in Libya, the Sahel region has experienced several conflicts. In 2016, the US built an enormous drone base in Agadez, Niger, from which it conducts drone strikes and aerial surveillance across the Sahel and the Sahara Desert. This is just one of the 29 non-military facilities in 15 countries on the African continent. In 2019, AFRICOM produced a list of the non-military bases on the African continent, and they include the Chebele in Djibouti, Entebbe, Uganda, Mombasa in Kenya, Libreville in Gabon, and many others in Ghana, Tunisia, Niger, Mali, Somalia, and Cameroon. France, on the other hand, has 10 bases in the continent, more than any other country outside Africa. All these military bases serve one and only purpose: to preserve, quote-unquote, the interests of NATO nations and Western corporate interests, usually for the benefit of capitalism. You could argue that the USA is also using these military bases to contain China and Russia in the continent. In 2013, China unrolled the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI in short, and it has so far invested in all African nations. Consequently, African nations have recognized Taiwan as part of China's territory, to the detriment of the US foreign policy. China also invested billions in the Mali-Guinea Rail project, the Sudan-Senegal railway line, the Ethiopian-Djibouti railway, the 2,600 megawatt Mambila hydropower project in Nigeria, and countless more projects across the region. In Central Africa, AFRICOM has been present in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, particularly in Camp Base, a military base outside Kisangani. There is also the issue of the recent migration crisis in Europe. The Sahel is dotted with military bases all the way from Mauritania to Chad. Europe has virtually moved its southern border from the northern edge of the Mediterranean Sea to the southern rim of the Sahara Desert. The coup d'etat in Niger is a threat to the $13 billion project to build a gas pipeline connecting the giant gas fields in Nigeria to Europe. After Europe and the USA imposed sanctions on Russia in 2002, Russia effectively cut supply of gas and oil to Europe. And then on the 26th of September 2022, the clandestine bombings of the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea by the USA left Europe paralyzed and in need of gas. The long-discussed 55,600 kilometer pipeline is to be connected to the energy system of Spain or Italy, was given fresh impetus after Russian gas supplies to the EU were cut off last year during the beginning of the Ukraine-Russian war. NATO's forces aim to protect this project at all costs. This was verified by the Commodore John Noel, who runs AFRICOM's partnership station. Noel says, and I quote, "We wouldn't be here if it wasn't in US interests, and any threats to those interests must be undermined by all means necessary." The burning question is, however, where is the African Union in all of this? I'm all out, guys. Please like and subscribe. Kwaheri.